Good afternoon, everyone. Today is November 2nd, 2021. It's Tuesday at 1:04 p.m. We're here in Maryland Public Service Commission case number or docket number PC54, Montgomery County Community Choice Pilot Work Group. I'm going to start by stating the names that are on the participant list. Someone pointed out to me that without actually going through the roll, you can't see that on a replay of this meeting. So, and excuse me if I mispronounce any names. My name is Jennifer Grace. I'm the public utility law judge who's appointed to this matter. With us today are Abner Sadek, Adam Fairbanks, Al Bartlett, Anna Joy Harris, Ashish Mehta, Beverly Sikora, Bill Fields, Bob Reaping, Dan Tudor, Daria Pugh, David Bloom, David Hoppick, Drew McAuliffe, Fran Francis, Jason Mathias, Jeffrey Trout, Kenneth Albert, Christina Montgomery, Lori McGilvray, Leah Gibbons, Lily Hawkins, Lisa Brennan, Lynn Fieri, Mark Fanning, Misty Renninger, Peter Wilson, Philip Vanderhayden, Robbie Atkins, Robert Loeb, Shan Gordon, Stan Edwards, Taylor Beckham, Tony Cusati, Tyler Wolverton, and Valerie Maoni. If I've missed anyone, it means that you've logged in, at least one person has logged in after I started calling roll, or you are logged in on a telephone number that doesn't note your name. If that's the case, will you please write your name in the chat box so that I can put you as present in the minutes of this meeting. At the last meeting, staff went over a proposal and as far as timelines and regarding some key issues and priorities and some simplifying assumptions. At the end of last meeting, we asked that the parties take a look at those simplifying assumptions and take a look at what staff had provided and to provide comments. So that's what we're going to do at the meeting today. Before we get started, though, there has been a request, several requests actually, for a little background information prior to going forward with the working group so that we're hopefully all starting from the same place. So I'm gonna, at the end of this meeting today, I'm gonna ask the utilities if anyone could possibly at next meeting provide a brief background on the SOS procurement process, PJM load assignment, and utility consolidated billing. So think about that. Talk to your folks offline while you're in this meeting, and let me know at the end of this meeting. We'll revisit that to see if we have any volunteers. Hopefully we'll have some volunteers. Okay, so that being said, does anybody want to address what we went over at the last meeting?
Hi, this is Stan Edwards from Montgomery County. Are you asking our reaction to the simplifying assumptions?
Yes.
Yeah. I didn't know if Phil wanted to say anything as a preface to that, but I would say that Montgomery County understands the need to have the aggregation program operate through in the same way as retail supply currently works. We're fully on board with that. What we are hoping to, or what we're seeking, is that the regulations not limit the county in any way to explore different options. So a couple of things, I guess. First of all, we think it might be good to come up with some definitions of the various entities involved in this process, so we're all speaking from the same sheet of music, if you will, about when we talk about the aggregation program. Who does that mean? Or the aggregator, who does that mean? An aggregation supplier, who does that mean? Et cetera. Some other regulations do that. One set we've looked at, for example, is Illinois, that has definitions, and that's typical in regulations, I know, but we thought Illinois were pretty well laid out. And the second thing it seems to me the operating assumption is that as long as the entity, whatever we end up calling it, is that Montgomery County has a contract with to administer our community choice program, including the procurement of electricity, as long as they comply with 7507 of the Public Utilities Article and Title 20, Subtitle 51 of COMAR, which regulates electricity suppliers, then that seems to me to be sufficient to meet this simplifying assumption, but also give Montgomery County as much latitude as possible to procure electricity options in the most favorable way to the county.
So this is Dave Hoppick with staff. Can you repeat your final point again? Apologies. You specifically referenced some PUA and things. If you could repeat that again.
Yeah, that 7507 of the Public Utilities Article and Title 20, Subtitle 51 of COMAR, and that, which means, of course, they'd have to, if they're not already authorized by the Public Service Commission to provide electricity in Maryland, they'd have to comply with all the requirements of the application for the license to supply electricity in Maryland.
So just to clarify my understanding, so you're saying that your supplier you're assuming would be subject to 7507 and Subtitle 51. Am I getting that correctly?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, in
Okay.
order to meet I think the desired option, which I think Montgomery County agrees with, that supplier consolidated billing and the other things associated with retail supply are in place.
So what about COMAR 2053, which are the various regulations that apply to retail suppliers?
I think the entity would have to comply with those as well, but I haven't researched what's in 2053, so I'd have to look at that more closely.
Hi, this is Fran. Oh, this is Fran Francis. I'm a little unclear as to what you're asking for. I heard you say maximum flexibility, but I'm not sure what you're looking for in terms of that. I just don't think I understand what you're saying. And could you speak a little bit louder?
I think the simplifying assumption could be read that the supplier that Montgomery County uses is a supplier that's already registered with the state of Maryland. And we're seeking that the entity that administers our program, again, including the procurement of electricity, not necessarily be one that's already authorized.
Are you seeking that they don't have to get authorized at some point?
No,
Or
I just described that they would have to follow the same procedures that suppliers have to follow under the Public Utilities Article that I mentioned and COMAR.
okay, thank you. Now I understand.
This is Lisa. Maybe it would be helpful to have Phil go through the simplifying assumption again for everybody, just to sort of describe what staff was thinking.
So this is Dave Hoppick, and Phil's got multiple tasks, so he's on, but he asked me to lead on this. So Lisa, you're talking about the simplifying assumption. Is that referring to like assumption number 9? We had multiple, so I just want to make sure I'm starting from the right place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the first one that really is it seems to me like 10 and 11 or at least 10 sort of follow from it. So let's start with 9.
Yeah, it seems to me that all the simplifying assumptions, 9, 10, and 11, all assume the same thing, that the supplier is essentially complying with, again, with the sections I cited from.
This is Tyler Wolverton. I don't know if it's also, Dave, if it's possible to maybe put that up on the screen. I don't know how the screen is controlled, but that might be helpful.
Yeah, Judge Grace, do you have that?
I'm working on it. I'm trying to sift through my documents to find the right one at this point.
Okay. So yeah, we read, this is Dave Hoppick for staff. The legislation itself specifically states, and I need to find the correct reference, that the supplier is kind of required to use, the county is get to the right place. It talks about 101F, and the community choice aggregator means a county that serves as electric allocator for the purpose of negotiating the purchase of electric generation services from a supplier licensed by the commission. So, I think, at first blush, Stan, we're on the same page. You do need a supplier who has gone through the existing processes to become a supplier at the commission. But if you were to negotiate with someone who's not a current supplier, that would be fine. They just need to go through the process. And then, so diving a little deeper again and reviewing our assumption 9, this was that the supplier selected by the county to meet the load incorporates any county-owned generation or county-owned or county contracted generation or storage into its contract with the county, such that there is a single entity responsible for the load. And I believe Bev was talking a bit the last time about that, and this goes to my understanding as well, that basically with PJM, each customer needs to have a single entity that kind of represents it and meets that customer's load in its entirety. So it's going through with that, understanding that there is this unique aspect where the legislation specifically calls out the ability of the county to own or contract for renewable generation or storage, and that whatever the entity is that kind of is facing to PJM, saying, to PJM, we are the ones who meet the load for these customers, that entity needs to account for the generation as part of its interface with PJM, such that you do not have a situation where PJM is meeting the load of a customer through two entities. That entity incorporates the generation and storage, to the extent it exists, into its overall supply through means to be determined, not predetermining that. But then there's that single entity that's kind of facing to PJM. So Lisa, was that a good recap for you all?
This is Robbie for PHI. I understand number 9 about Montgomery County choosing a third-party supplier to serve the customers. But number 4 says that Montgomery County is the default supplier. So are there going to be 2 suppliers? How will Montgomery County be a default supplier if they just have 1 supplier?
So, you know, default supplier refers to, in my mind, if you enter the county as a customer and you're a residential or the equivalent of a type 1 SOS customer, your default supplier is the community choice aggregator. Of course, under the legislation, a customer is free to choose to take SOS, is free to choose to have retail choice. But if they don't choose anything, they are supplied by the county.
So when I hear the term default supplier, I think provider of last resort. So for example, if the supplier that Montgomery County selects defaults at PJM, Montgomery County becomes that default supplier.
So, yeah, I don't know that, you know, we talked about this previously, I believe, with PHI, with Pepco last week. I think the mechanism for that is something we need to talk through and think through. You know, here we have the phrase default supplier, and I agree with you, it is not the same term as supplier of last resort. You know, my understanding of supplier of last resort is who PJM turns to if the retail supplier basically defaults with PJM, who picks up their load, right? And currently that's SOS. So I think that is a topic to explore further. But we were referring to 4 more in the vein of if a customer moves to the service territory and they do not select standard offer service, they do not select retail choice, they are served by the county community choice aggregation.
So Dave, would it, and I don't know if we're trying to wordsmith this. I mean, that sounds more to me, the term I would use is like opt out. Like they would have to opt out of Montgomery County being their supplier. Just the word default, I think it's a little tricky, but I think this is Tyler from Pepco.
Yeah. Okay, Tyler. Yeah, no, I hear your, okay, so, all right. So the CCA becomes the supplier unless the customer opts out. Is that kind of how you would revise that phrasing? How you would propose to revise that phrasing?
So, yeah, something along those lines. Doesn't have to be exactly that, but yeah.
Also, or has a contract with a third-party supplier already.
Yes. So yeah, if you know the legislation spells out in great detail the process for, you know, notifying and customers, you know, either opting out if they're on SOS or having the ability to opt out if they're on SOS, but they're on retail choice, remaining with their retail choice provider up until the contract would expire. So yeah, Tyler, I hear where you're going with that. So I'll make a note of that.
This is Robbie from PHI. One last thing. On number 4, it says upon acceptance by the PSC. Do they have to approve this process still? Or why is that statement there?
Okay, you're looking at 4?
Number 4. It says CCA becomes upon acceptance by the PSC.
Yeah, so the CCA submits an application to the commission. And so the commission has to approve basically the county's plan for becoming the community choice aggregator. And
Okay.
so that is the trigger. Once once they have been approved, you know, I would need to think through a little more. There might be some additional steps, but you know, the commission has to approve the county's application plan, if I'm getting the exact wording. Hopefully getting close to the exact wording.
Well, and David, don't they also have to approve kind of how we structure this to work and including how it impacts choice and the current SOS process? Because it's going to, absolutely. So, I mean, the commission has to, and I'm sorry, someone's got a lot of background noise that it's really hard to concentrate. But there's, you know, there's going to be changes that are going to be necessary, and the commission, I think, is going to have to approve those as well.
Yeah, well, the legislation specifically calls out the commission making changes potentially to, or creating a mechanism over 2 years through which to protect standard offer service customers. So yes, there's multiple decision points for the commission.
This is Bill Fields. I had a comment in here. I think this discussion about default supplier raises a question, or maybe we need to make sure that we're dealing with two separate possibilities or two separate issues. One is, I think, what we were just talking about, which is, you know, the aggregation is up and running. They've selected, you know, a company, and that, or, you know, they've got an arrangement with a retail supplier who's licensed, and new, you know, somebody comes into the service territory, starts a new account, into Montgomery County, starts a new account. You know, I think the idea is that there's a process that new account, unless they do, you know, say otherwise, that account goes to whatever that supply company is. A different situation is if all that is up and running and happening, you know, what if there's an issue with that supply company and they have a problem and are no longer able to serve customers? You know, PJM kicks them out for some reason. They don't pay their PJM bill. You know, that obviously the way that works now, I mean, the way that works for regular situation is that SOS is the default supplier, and those customers go back to SOS when that happens. You know, something for us to deal with here is, are we going to have you know, something under the regulation, some way that, how do we deal with those customers if the Montgomery County's retail supplier can no longer serve the customers?
Yeah, this is Bob Rieping from Potomac Edison. Also, to just add on to what Bill was saying is, you know, the other part of that, if that was to come back to SOS under a CCA supplier default, most likely then it's going to reset the baseline for the suppliers who are providing polar service, which will then create an increment where those suppliers are served at the spot market pricing, which could impact all polar customers at that point through potentially higher prices. It could be potentially lower. So if the intent is not to harm those customers who are not part of the CCA, then you also need to consider how that potential additional cost is distributed. Is it distributed across all customers or just the customers coming back from the CCA due to that default?
So this is Dave Hoppa. If you look at, and I'm looking at the section 507, 510.3 of the legislation. In it, under section V, it talks about the commission adopting regulations to implement this section, and it includes a number of things they have to do, and it includes number 10 is procedures by which a community choice aggregation may be dissolved, including procedures for the transfer of customers to SOS. And then it says, and the resale of contracted electricity supply. So I think that captures the kind of what if things go south situation, and the commission is supposed to come up with regs to address that.
Well, but
that
David,
potential.
you're assuming that if the supplier that the CCA selects goes belly up or whatever, that the CCA is dissolving. Is that a given? Can the CCA try and somehow keep its customers and get in another supplier? I mean, I don't know if that can happen quickly or not, but.
So yeah, Bev, I think that's an outstanding question, something to think through. So, all right.
Can I ask a question about what happens now under retail choice? I heard someone say it goes back to SOS. I'm assuming the difference here that might raise some concerns is that the volume of customers at one time returning to SOS might be greater than it currently is under any supplier, existing supplier. Is that accurate?
Yeah, this is Bob briefing. I'm the one that brought it up, and that would be my assumption. I would think this particular pilot, because we are defaulting all customers to the CCA, unless they opt out, it would be, in my opinion, I don't know what the exact load's going to be, but I would think it'd be significant enough to create an increment if it were to ever come back, which would cause potential issues.
But particularly, I assume, in the PEPCO territory.
Yeah, I think it might be beyond PEPCO. This is Dave Oppett, the staff. But yeah, if all the load was to revert back to SOS, that would be a lot of load. And previously we talked about a bit about increments and decrements. And my understanding is that would be definitely beyond increments for at the very least PEPCO. So yeah, Phil mentioned, the potential to need something like an emergency SOS bid. So I think we need to think through kind of the potential scenarios and solutions for those potential scenarios.
Dave, this is Bill Field. I think that's right. And I think you could envision, or you can envision, a scenario where, it's known that the customer, a large number of customers are coming back at a point in the future. Or I think you can also envision a scenario where you don't know, or maybe you just have nobody knows, or maybe you just have a couple days notice or something, and they're already there. And PJM's going to assign them to somebody, and the last resort is always the local utility. So You know, that's where PJM is going to send them if they don't have anybody else to send them to. And
So
when
Bill
I
and
say
Dave,
when I say send them, I mean assign the cost to that entity, to some entity.
Right. So Bill and David Schwab. What you're almost describing is the supplier step up that we have if a polar supplier defaults, as opposed to just a simple retail assignment back to SOS load. Is that what you're thinking, Bill or Dave, or were you describing something different?
Well, no, I was thinking about the different ways that it might happen that that Montgomery County supplier is no longer, you know, able to serve load, and you know there's a default that, and some other entity needs to serve that load. That could either happen, you know, it could be known ahead of time that it's coming, or it could happen sort of, you know, right, you know, instantaneously almost. I mean, PJM could declare some supplier in default and switch those customers to somebody, you know, without really any notice that anybody could do anything about it.
Right. So, and I'm with you, Bill. Maybe I'm just stepping ahead a little bit on it. But, you know, what I described earlier is if the load comes back to the utility, the way I look at it, as we're talking about, we probably have two options. One, we assign it to the current SOS suppliers for each of the utilities, and then it goes through the normal process. If it creates an increment, then we have to deal with it that way. The other way, I guess I was thinking about that, and I think it was David, his suggestion kind of spurred the thought. If this CCA load were to come back, it'd still come back to the utility. In the interim, the utility serves it at market rates, but you could have almost what's similar to our supplier step up, which is part of the polar process, where you offer that load to the current polar providers at whatever the current contract rate is. And if you don't get those suppliers, then I think David had mentioned you go out and you do essentially an emergency procurement. And that's what we have designed into the process already for a polar supplier default. So I was just trying to get a little more insight if that's what David was thinking, or just kind of he indirectly ended up there.
So, you know, I think we were thinking at a bit higher level than you were, Bob, but, you know, the thought was if there is suddenly a lot more load, you know, one option would be, and obviously if it's completely unanticipated, there would be some sort of incremental period that would need to be covered, but you could do a kind of very quick SOS bid to meet that additional load. And, you know, maybe part of this process is laying out how that would work for the commission. Did that answer your question?
This is Bill. I'll just add on. I think something for us to consider is an advantage to keeping it separate, keeping the load that returns separated from SOS is you don't have to worry about imposing risk on the suppliers, on the SOS suppliers, and you could impose risk on them, and they could price that risk in. Now it may never ever trigger that customers come back, but the SOS has still been impacted in the meantime because the wholesale suppliers perceive a risk and they price something in for that. So I see an advantage to coming up with a process where that load is kept separated and dealt with as Bob and Dave Bob was talking about, through an emergency basis, through some kind of procurement, you know, somehow you deal with it, but if you can keep it separate, then you don't have to worry about its impact on the rest of SOS.
So following Bill's train of thought, and I want to make sure that Montgomery County gets a, you know, reacts to what we're saying here. It sounds like under the current system, you know, there's a 5% limit on kind of an increase in load. If it goes beyond that, the utility is basically purchasing from the spot market. So, and maybe this is a question for SOS suppliers, would that increase the risk given those existing kind of upward limits? And then the option, I believe it was described earlier, to take this additional load kind of at current contract rates. Like, does that, like, I understand Bill's risk, but given that the 5% cap is there, how much more risk do we think this might create?
So Dave, this is Jeff Trout. I think the question is for the county. This discussion began about half an hour ago with the county saying it wanted maximum flexibility, and then we went down this particular issue. But I think it's really for the county to articulate in the first instance, do they want to have one supplier or multiple suppliers? What do they want to have happen if their one supplier fails, or if they have multiple suppliers, whether one of their multiple suppliers fail? And then the rest of us who have been working with retail choice and standard offer service for the last 2 decades can help the county understand what the consequences are of the preference they've expressed, and maybe at that point their preference will change. But we need to start with, what does the county mean when they say they want maximum flexibility? What does that mean?
So Jeff, my one caveat on that is I'm assuming you still, for each customer, have a single supplier facing towards PJM. Is that, do you still have that?
Yeah, that's a requirement at the PJM level. Nothing we do can change that, but how you accomplish that, presumably there are multiple ways to do that.
This is Lisa, and I'll of course let Stan and Jason pipe in, but I agree with what Jeff was saying. Is really, it would be, I think we're skipping to the end of the process. What happens if the aggregator dissolves? And I'm not saying that's not an important thing to know, and yes, it would be very helpful to know what the consequences of different decisions are, but we haven't had, like, Judge Grace suggested a class on SOS procurement. So I think we're sort of putting the cart before the horse a little bit, at least for what I think we would be able to talk to at this point. And I'll let Stan speak for himself, but what I think what Stan was getting to earlier was the very beginning stages of how the county is going to put together the program and flexibility as far as who we contract with to accomplish this. I'll let Stan speak now, but I think it would be helpful to go back to sort of the beginning of this discussion. And yes, I agree, for all of this, the county needs to understand the consequences and then, determine what our preferences are.
Yeah, I won't put myself forth as an expert on these procurement issues, but the way I see this under SOS, you purchase from a number of different generators to meet the supply. And if one of those can't meet the supply, you have procedures in place to backfill that some way. And I just envision us doing the same thing. We have one, I guess, forward-facing supplier, as David described it, and they're getting generation from a number of different sources. One of them can't meet the load requirements, then we have a mechanism in our contract with them where they have to figure out how to backfill that in the same way that SOS does it, or the same way a retail supplier does it. So I don't think we're asking for anything different than what is currently in place for retail suppliers.
Well, a retail supplier presumably has multiple wholesale sources of their supply, and so that's certainly true. But and you would certainly in your contract with them address how they would handle a situation where they had to deal with one of their wholesale supply contracts defaulting. But the question that has occupied us mostly so far on this call is the question of what you do if that retail supplier goes out of business, which sometimes happen, or has issues, which sometimes happens. And it sounded to me at the beginning of this call like you were contemplating having multiple retail suppliers.
No,
and if that's not what you had in mind, then I'll stop.
Yeah, no, that I didn't mean to imply that. If I did imply it, that's not what we intend. We would have one supplier, one retail supplier that might get power from multiple sources in the same way that a current retail supplier does. But
so Jeff, you're circling back as to what if that single supplier defaults and covering
And that's
that
what we've been
situation.
talking about for the last. So
I would agree with you on that.
I think that's maybe it's not step 37 in the analysis, but it's not step 1 or step 2. And so we're definitely going to have to deal with that issue. And we've had a very good discussion that illustrates some of the problems that we will have to work through with respect to that. But I, for one, don't think we should get bogged down here now. We're going to have to resolve it, but we can resolve it later, and it's going to take time to resolve it.
and I just want to make sure I understand that while there are procedures in place to deal with that now, the reason it becomes more critical in the case of the CCA is that the magnitude of the return, if you will, could be many times larger than what might happen with any current supplier.
That's my perspective.
Yeah, that's staff's understanding as well, that under the current system, there are lots of suppliers and lots of customers with different suppliers, but the concentration with any individual supplier, for example, in Potomac Edison service territory, is nowhere near as large as the concentration of customers who will be on the CCA. Jeff, would you agree with that?
I would.
So, but it seems like we do have agreement on, staff's simplifying assumption number 9, and that there is a single entity or tentative agreement. Let me put it that way, because I know Montgomery County is still learning, that there's kind of one entity kind of facing towards, there is one entity that kind of is the entity at PJM meeting load, and that entity is through different mechanisms which are yet to be determined, but that entity is incorporating any potential solar generation, storage, what have you. Am I correct in that, Stan and Lisa?
Yes, I think that's a fair assumption.
Okay, thank you. I think that's very helpful for us, and does make things. There's a lot of wheels we don't have to reinvent with that.
This is Lori Montgomery. Before we leave this, I would really appreciate returning to Stan's first point regarding definitions and making sure that really clear about the definitions, some of which are provided in the law, but we may need to flesh it out a little bit more in the regulations. And so the point I wanted to raise on number 9 is, by using the term aggregation supplier, are we limiting our understanding of what that entity is that the county will contract with to simply the entity supplying the electricity, whether it's from a source, multiple sources, or is it more, can we think of it broadly enough that it may be the supplier of electricity and other services, aggregation services associated with the aggregation program, such as communication with the customers, offering of energy efficiency programs, those kinds of things. So that's why I think it would be helpful to really have these clarifying definitions, so that when we use the term aggregation supplier, we understand what roles and responsibilities are included in that term.
So, Lori, is a tentative reaction. You know, I think the answer is to the latter. You know, the legislation says that, you know, that entity that, you know, you negotiate with, that is, you know, in my mind, forward facing to PJM, they have to be licensed by the commission. But I don't think there's a limit on kind of what you all have contracted with them to do, for me at first blush. I'd be curious if others have any reaction to that. But yeah, I think the limit is that they have to be licensed by the commission.
So just on that point, are we agreeing that it would be helpful to have, and fairly soon here, have some language around the definition of aggregation supplier, aggregation, government aggregator, that, you know, the things in the law, and then maybe a few more words about what that includes?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable ask. Judge Grace, did you have thoughts on that one?
No, I'm writing this down. I definitely think that we can go there next. Mr. Stan Edwards said that he thought that the Illinois example was a good one. Stan, would you be willing to share that with the group? Is that
Yeah,
something that you can share with the group?
Sure.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and if maybe the Montgomery County folks could send a tentative list of things they'd like to see defined, and, you know, staff can think about this as well. But I think that would be helpful in making sure if we do have that task, we're including all the things in it that we have for the task.
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, thank you. So did Montgomery County, were you kind of ready to go on to simplifying assumption number 10? Did we want to revisit, kind of re-summarize that? That one's pretty simple. It's basically saying that, you know, there will be the continued use of utility consolidated billing for the billing and payment to the utility, to the CCA through that existing mechanism.
Yeah, I think that 10 and 11 all fall in line with what we talked about for 9.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just ask, this is Lisa, can I just ask, does that mean we're not considering supplier consolidated building?
So Phil knows more about supplier consolidated billing than myself, but my understanding is that basically the regulations have been created, but it's not actually up and running yet. So maybe one of the utilities can provide a little more color on that, but it's something that's not functioning as of this time. And my understanding, it's going to be a little while before it is something that is functioning. Tyler, are you going to?
Sorry, Dave, did you ask me something? I didn't hear.
I thought I heard you, because I was asking the utilities to give a little more color on where we are in the timeline for supplier consolidated billing.
Yeah, I'm not super involved in that. I know I don't want to throw any name. Robbie, can you give an update on where that is? I'm not exactly
Yeah,
sure.
at this time, we only have the 2 billing options that are in use today. That's dual billing and the utility consolidated billing. Supplier billing is coming roughly 2023, 24. So at this point, it's just the UCB mechanism that's going to be in place at the time when CCA goes in. If that helps.
Yeah. So Lisa, staff is starting with the assumption that we would use supplier consolidated billing as the framework to begin with, and then potentially revisit
supplier consolidated billing.
Yes, I'm sorry, utility consolidated billing. Thank you for catching that. And then potentially revisit once supplier consolidated billing is kind of up and running.
Okay, and the dual billing, is that on the table or no?
My understanding with dual billing is that it's typically used by very large commercial, very large industrial type of customers, and there are very, very few residential customers, for example, who are on dual billing.
Okay, so that wouldn't be applicable to this situation anyway.
Well,
Yeah,
David, I don't think that suppliers typically do use it for residential. I don't think there's anything that says they can't.
Yeah, I would agree with Bev on that. I think part of our assumption was there's an existing mechanism in terms of creating a simple process for the purpose of a pilot. Sure. And that, if you do dual billing, you would need to, endure the expense of creating that. Whereas, with purchase of receivables and utility consolidated billing, there's an existing system that's already built. and it deals with it. There's an existing mechanism for payment, purchase of receivables, and things like uncollectibles and things like that. And those may need to be reviewed and potentially thought about how it would need to be tweaked for community choice aggregation. But there's an existing process, and it on its face it looks like that is the most readily available way to move forward relatively quickly and simply with a pilot.
Okay, I just wanted to understand the dual billing. It seems to me, and I am stretching the limits of what I understand about dual billing, but if there's a current energy supplier that already exists, a licensed supplier that already exists that's doing dual billing, might there be a benefit to keeping that separate billing, the dual billing?
So one of the issues with dual billing is that there's not a mechanism for, or there's less of a stick if people don't pay. So with, and utilities, please correct me if I'm wrong about this, but a big part of why utility consolidated billing was created was that if under dual billing a customer didn't pay, the supplier could send notices, they could make lots of phone calls, but there's never the stick of, okay, your power is going to be shut off. Whereas with utility consolidated billing, because the utility purchases the receivable and they kind of own the whole bill now, the customer, if they don't pay their supply side, energy side of the bill, they can be cut off. So it retains the payment incentive mechanism that the utility has. So
okay, so it's more likely that a supplier would be happy to have UCB versus dual billing.
My understanding is that the vast majority, setting aside supplier consolidated billing, the vast majority of especially residential retail suppliers want and choose to use utility consolidated billing rather than dual billing, in large part because if the customer doesn't pay, they, the POR mechanism pays them, and then B, there is that stick for the customer. Whereas if it's dual billing, that stick only exists on the distribution bill being sent by the distribution utility.
Got it. Okay, my goal here was just to make sure that we weren't eliminating an option that a supplier we might want to contract with would find preferable, and therefore like they wouldn't want to deal with us. So
Lisa, it will also depend though, because there are certain things that you can't put that under the law can't be put on the utility bill. So, we talked about what being an aggregator means. Well, if you want this aggregator to perhaps do more than, just be the electricity supplier, and somehow that comes at a charge, and I'm not looking at it now, but there are restrictions on what can be placed on the utility bill. So it might be that you have to weigh the pros and cons of, okay, there's this other stuff we want this supplier to do. And, it's going to have to get billed to the customer, but we can't put it on the utility bill. So, do we then use the utility bill and figure out a different way to bill them, or do we just, bill it all together? I'm not denying that most suppliers use utility consolidated billing, but my question is only, if we have to deal with the mechanics of doing both options for you, and it's going to, cost more time and more money because we have to do more program to accommodate, it would be good for us to know up front which option, you'd prefer, so that we don't go down the path of billing both and you never use, or not billing, we don't go down the path of programming for both and you never use one of the options.
I totally understand that. I was not trying to open a can of worms. What I was trying to do is make sure that making a choice does not cut off, if there's a, again, I am not familiar enough with the United, the consolidated billing versus dual billing. I just want to make sure that we're not cutting off, a group of possible excited energy suppliers that might not want to deal with the county if we do one or the other. But everything that I'm hearing sounds like the UCB makes the most sense and is the least confusing, and making sort of decisions and building in the programming once.
Everybody, this is Fran Francis on behalf of AOPA. I just want to say that we do have members that have hundreds of small commercial accounts that are master metered apartments that do use the dual billing option. So that is out there, and that option is being used. I do not believe the majority of our members use that option, but we do have several.
Dave, this is Lori. Can you just clarify the dual billing versus consolidated billing and how that might impact low-income energy assistance? Because I understand that there's some issues about having dual billing and the way in which the low-income resident that's receiving energy assistance gets their payment.
I don't have any firsthand knowledge of how that affects low-income assistance, because the members that we have doing that don't serve that customer group. So I don't know, but I do know that there are hundreds of master metered apartment accounts that are under the type 1 that do use dual billing.
So Lori, I do not know offhand how low-income assistance would flow through to a dual billing, for example, residential customer. I don't know if any of the utilities have any insights on that.
Dave, and I'm not like an expert on this. There may be folks on the phone that know better, but I think a lot of the assistance that's available in Maryland right now, at least on the electric side, requires budget billing, which may kind of take dual billing out of the equation. So it may just not really be a factor per se. And again, I don't think I've never seen a residential customer bill outside of what Fran was talking about, where those are commercial customers, but with lots of, like, an apartment building with lots of residential units in it. I've never seen like a residential single family apartment townhouse bill that was dual billed. So I'm just, I don't know. It's hard for me to speculate on how it would work because I just am not aware of that in practice, but I might be wrong. Or maybe there's somebody else who knows more.
Yeah, so the reason I bring it up, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but I had heard that with community solar, if you get most of your electricity from community solar, you get a bill directly from the community solar provider, and you would get a separate utility bill, but that the mechanism the state uses to reimburse the low-income family for energy assistance is through payment on their regular Petco bill. And so they would not be fully reimbursed for the community solar portion of the bill. And that, I believe, has been a conversation around community solar.
I'm sorry, you cut out right at the end there. I did not catch the last part of what you said.
Oh, that I just understand, and I'm hoping other people know more about this than I, but that this has been an issue for low-income families that are receiving energy assistance actually having community solar, which is billed separately because they are not reimbursed for that portion of their utility.
Well, so let me just, okay, let me make sure I understand. So I, I think that if you are a subscriber to a community solar subscriber organization, that subscriber organization will, you have to pay to be a member of that subscriber organization, and then you get a credit that, and there's a way that that's calculated based on our rates that shows up on your bill depending on how much you've kind of signed up for. I guess that's my understanding of how that works. I'm not clear on. I guess I'm not clear just generally on the point that you were making, but
Yeah,
I'm
so
also
I
not sure if
think
I
Phil
understand.
knows
Yeah.
more about this, but maybe just put a note that however the consolidated or dual billing works out, and maybe it sounds like it'll be consolidated, so it shouldn't be an issue, that there aren't any particular wrinkles as it relates to low-income energy assistance.
Yeah, this is Robbie for PHI. Just to give you a really high level overview, the way that it works, it's just a billing option. So for the customer, how many bills does that customer want to receive? If they're on dual billing, they're getting 2 bills. They get their bill from Pepco, they get their bill from the supplier. So all the Pepco charges are still going to be on that portion of the bill that we send to the customer. Under UCB, they get 1 bill that has both Pepco and the supplier charges. That's the only difference between dual billing and bill ready or UCB. It's just 1 bill versus 2 bills.
Well, but there's also the payment, if it goes through UCB, they just pay us and we pass, we pay, there's a discount, but we pay you or pay the supplier. If it's dual billed, the supplier's dealing with all the uncollectibles. But again, like I said, there's things that you can't put on you can't just put whatever you want on the utility bill if that's the option you're going for. That you can't try, and if the supplier offered, some other service that isn't energy related, that's not supposed to go on the utility bill if you use utility consolidated bill. So
Correct. We can't purchase non-commodity charges from the supplier.
right.
Yeah. But I was just saying that, dual bill versus bill ready, it's the same bill. It's just Pepco sends it out by itself without supplier charges, or under UCB, we send out both Pepco and the supplier. The payment process is different where if it's dual, they pay the supplier directly versus UCB, they pay the utility and then we pay the supplier. But the Pepco portion of the bill will look it'll be identical under dual or bill ready. It's just dual will not have the supplier charges on there. That's like the biggest
Robbie, you
difference.
introduced a new term, bill ready, that
I'm
I
sorry.
don't think.
It's UCB. UCB.
Yeah.
Sorry. We said bill ready back in 2000. Sorry, my bad.
So Lori, I have written this question down to respond to that request.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is Sean Gordon. I actually work with some community solar companies, and they do bill differently. So some have their own billing that's direct. They kind of take over the bill, and others do a dual bill. And so I'm also really worried about that what happens as far as the energy assistance part. And I hope that we can figure that out in a way that works for people. Thank you.
This is Lisa again. So can we also add to the things that we may need to circle back to, the energy efficiency programs? Because Bev's mentioned this a couple times, and I think it's a really good point. If there's an issue, so community choice aggregators can provide and promote energy efficiency programs. There's, according to the bill. So I think that just may be something that we need to circle back to. I'm not saying it's the biggest thing we're talking about today, so I think maybe it would be better not to get off, too far down that road, but maybe we can circle back to that.
So yeah, Lisa, this is Dave. So you want to circle back on, as you note correctly, the bill specifically says the charge for the CCA can include energy efficiency. Is there an issue with the utility purchasing that part under utility consolidated billing?
Yes.
That's your question, correct?
Yeah, just I've suggested that could raise issues for UCB. Can we park that next to the energy assistance programs and how that works? I'm not saying it's not better to do UCB. I'm just saying we would want to make sure that we've contemplated how to do it. If we want to. And again, these are all trying to maintain the flexibility that Stan was mentioning.
Hey, David, this is Leah Gibbons from NRG.
Okay.
Just on this last point that got raised around energy efficiency, I'm following that part of the conversation. I guess to the extent you're sort of flagging issues for, more robust discussion and further exploration later, I think that from the perspective of equity between how the CCA is going to be treated and the rest of the retail market, I would definitely put a pin on this piece as well, because clearly, this is one of these issues that was hotly debated during the SCB discussions in terms of, what can be included in pricing and all of that. And so I would just respectfully ask that we actually put that on the list as well. I mean, from my perspective, one of the things we're concerned about is just making sure that the retail market is not damaged in any way throughout this process. So, clearly if we're setting it up in such a way that we have great inequity, then that would be problematic from our perspective. So if you can note that as well, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yep, so noted, Leah. So it sounds like we can turn to simplifying assumption 11, which was staff's assumption that enrollment after the initial notice process functions according to established retail choice enrollment procedures and deadlines. Did folks have any reaction on that part?
This is Stan. I think, again, consistent with 9 and 10, we're fine with that.
Okay.
Wait, hang on. This is Robbie for PHI. So it's talking about established procedures. So we have 3-day switching. That's the established procedure. That's not what it's saying in here where it says on day 1 that customer goes to the CCA.
Yeah,
Robbie, I recall Phil saying on our last call that, this certainly implicates instant connects. And I also raised on that call that I agreed, and that it's instant connect is also implicated later in the statute, because it's an opportunity for customers to opt out as well. So shopping customers also have the opportunity to use instant connect. So I think that does take us down you know, it's another set of issues we're going to have to discuss.
Right. But just where I said establish retail choice enrollment procedures, does that mean as it's being done today, or what we're going to create or develop during this process?
So Leah is correct. Phil did mention the instant connect issue. So I think that is a topic we are going to have to dive into.
Okay.
So those, you know, the three big assumptions, primary simplifying assumptions, were 9, 10, and 11. Do we want to go through the others as well, or where would Judge Grace and the county like to kind of go from here?
Did the county have any issues with anything else that was contained within staff's what staff shared with us at the last meeting?
Not off the top of my head, but we were focused on those simplifying assumptions, which clearly still have some discussion need to go on around them. But I don't recall anything of the other sort of summary points that we found inconsistent with the law.
Can I ask a question about number 15, Judge Grace?
Yeah, apparently I have to mute and muting and unmuting while I'm sharing is a little difficult. So yeah, go ahead.
So number 15 says, this is just, you know, this is under the simplifying assumption number 11. CCA may not assess new taxes unrelated to electricity costs, including energy efficiency and renewable energy. I don't believe that's correct.
I think that's just perhaps awkward wording of that.
Yeah, I think maybe
we're including within electricity costs, energy efficiency, and renewable energy.
okay. So you're relating, the parentheses is related just to electricity costs. All right, that's fine. I just want to make sure we were all still allowing for the possibility of energy efficiency programs and promoting renewables. Okay.
Yeah, in our mind, that's explained quite clearly in the legislation. So.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
So in 7510.3J, it says a community choice aggregator may not assess any new fee, tax, or other charge in the aggregation charges or rates that is not related to the cost of 1, providing electricity supply and electricity supply service, including service from a generating station owned by the community choice aggregator, 2, promoting the use of renewable energy, and 3, providing and promoting energy efficiency programs promoted under paragraphs 2 or 3 of this subsection. And then it goes on to 2 or 3. So that's what that's referring to.
That's what I understood it was referring to. It just looked, when it said including, that seemed a little awkward to me because it's really, if under the CCA may not assess new taxes, it's really excluding those. But I understand whoever said it was related. You're talking about the definition of electricity costs. That's fine, as long as we all, as long as we understand where it's referring to and what it means.
Yeah, I think you could add within the parentheses electricity costs, including, so you could have 2 electricity costs in that simplifying assumption 15. It would read CCA may not assess new taxes unrelated to electricity costs, parentheses, electricity costs, including energy efficiency and renewable energy.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that our framework, we were all on the same page as what we were talking about trying to get the basics down at this point. Thank you.
Could I just raise, if we're ready to move on, just raise a question about number 19? This is Lori McGilvray again. This has to do with contracts in excess of 2 years must be submitted to the commission with a plan for transfer under dissolution of the CCA. So I just want to be sure that this is really just about contracts in excess of 2 years getting approval from the commission, but it isn't restricting the ability of the county to enter into a contract in excess of 2 years for, say, example, a wholesale supplier like offshore wind, that they may want to enter into a contract of 4 years for that supply, hypothetically, and they would just need to get approval from the commission for that because it exceeds the 2 years. They would not be limited in their ability to enter into such a contract.
If the retail supplier is entering into wholesale contracts, my understanding is that this would not apply, and the retail supplier can enter into any wholesale contracts it wants to. But maybe, no, maybe I'm wrong about that.
So I don't know if you have 7-510.3 in front of you, but if you look down to K3, double I, it says when a community choice aggregator contracts for service from an electric generating facility for a period exceeding 2 years, they shall submit to the commission a plan for the transfer of the contract to another electricity supplier if the community choice aggregator is dissolved or the pilot program ends without an extension of, ends without an extension or the creation of a permanent community choice aggregator.
Yeah, I don't read this to say that the commission approves contracts longer than 2 years. They just, in the event of a dissolution or the program ending, then there's engagement with the Public Service Commission.
So Stan, my non-lawyer mind looking at this is if you do enter into a contract with, for example, a solar provider, like if somebody were to build a solar facility or you were to build a solar facility and there's some sort of contract for more than 2 years, you need to submit a plan to the commission to address these, 1 and 2, if it's dissolved, 1, or if it ends without an extension or the creation of a permanent program. So I would need to think a little bit more about how the commission reacts to the submitted plan, but I read it as requiring you to submit a plan in that instance.
So in the event we enter into a contract longer than 2 years, the plan is submitted so that if in fact the aggregation is dissolved, the aggregator is dissolved, or the pilot ends, people know what's going to happen with that supply.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. But there's no, so is there, the law doesn't specify anything about, I guess, as you said, David, that what the commission would do. Would that be something that would be, I don't read this though. I guess what I'm saying is I don't read this as the Public Service Commission approving the contract or disapproving the contract. Is that fair, or is that?
The commission has to approve the plan of any contract that's going to be more than 2 years. The commission has to approve a plan so that they know what's going to happen either at the end of the pilot program or if it's dissolved.
Right, but the commission doesn't say, oh no, we don't approve this contract. They're saying we approve what you propose to do if the aggregation program is dissolved, but they don't say, the commission doesn't have a say in whether the contract is a good contract or a bad contract, except for that transfer issue. Is that right?
Well, if the commission's not satisfied with that there's a plan in place for, if the aggregator's dissolved,
Yeah.
then I'm not sure. I mean, the commission's not entering in with Montgomery County to approve or disapprove a contract, but the contract has to satisfy, if you go over 2 years, the contract has to satisfy the commission with regards to these two issues.
Well, really one issue, right, is how we're going to transfer to another supplier under two different circumstances. But the only issue they're looking at is there an adequate plan for transferring the supply? That's the issue the Public Service Commission is giving the thumbs up or the thumbs down to. No other aspects of the contract is all I'm trying to understand.
I think related to the specific contract, my non-attorney mind is thinking that's what they're, is the plan adequate to do this? So that I don't want to weigh in on the other, right? Because there's the entire plan that's also being approved, and I don't want to weigh in on what all they're reviewing in that without thinking about that a little more.
This is Bob Loeb. I have a question related. What happens if the retail reseller signs the contract instead of the community aggregator? Do these two conditions still hold?
I would need to take that one back. Any other thoughts from the group would be appreciated, though.
Bob, can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, Stan, what if you sign a contract with your reseller, giving the reseller the right to sign contracts with that are more than 2 years? And then the contract is it's not been signed by the county or the community aggregator, but the contract is signed by the reseller that the county has contracted with. The contract with the generator is signed by the reseller. It's not signed by the county aggregator.
Gotcha. Thank you.
This is Drew McCaw from staff. I think the answer to your question would really be in the definition of community choice aggregator. So that definition includes the language that, the community choice aggregator means a county that serves as an electric aggregator for the purpose of negotiating the purchase of electric generation services from an electricity supplier licensed by the commission. So if the supplier is signing the contract, they're still under the umbrella of the community choice aggregator, would be my reading of that. So it still falls under the responsibility of the aggregator.
I think this is an example of where having these definitions well understood and agreed to would be important.
Yeah, but that definition is in the bill.
Okay. But just to make sure we all have a common interpretation of that definition, I think is important.
Yeah, I agree with Stan. I think we might need to circle back to that one, because I guess my question from a logistics point of view is, how would we know what our supplier has in the contracts that it has with its wholesalers, basically? Because I'm not sure how practically how this works in in real life.
This is Drew McCall again. Well, I would say this part of the law we're looking at isn't referring to all the contracts the supplier has. It's just if you're specifically requiring service from a specific facility. So if you look at, what is it, the 7510K 2II kind of has the same language, 2 paragraphs above where we were looking at. So it's saying when a community choice aggregator builds or acquires a generating facility or storage facility, the community choice aggregator shall submit to the commission a plan, if the aggregator is dissolved. So it's the same language, 2 paragraphs above as well. But this isn't referring to all the contracts a supplier would have. This is if the community is specifically going after one specific generator.
Yeah, okay, that confused me, but I think we're going to need to revisit this. Because I think Lisa raises a good point. We might enter into a contract with a supplier who's buying power from all sorts of different sources, and we may not know the details of all those particular contracts. So some of them may be more than 2 years. Does that mean they have to be reviewed by the commission, and how would we know that?
And to that point, this is Lori McGilvray. Why would the law and the PSC treat one wholesale supplier that was specified by the county versus another wholesale supplier, so that if the supplier, the generator specified by the county, say a solar farm, they entered into a 4-year contract, and so you'd have to go through all these hoops if it was one specified by the county. But if the retailer had a long-term contract with another solar farm not specified by the county, it wouldn't have to go through these hoops. So I too am finding this very confusing.
Yeah, this is Drew McCall from staff again. Yeah, obviously we didn't write the bill, but I would assume they put these sections in to allow Montgomery County to build its own generating facility. So that's why I guess they felt the need to put, specific language as to what happens to that generation if this dissolves. Because if Montgomery County has a contract with the supplier, you'd expect they'd be able to, survive if this CCA is dissolved. But if there was a specific solar facility built just for this CCA, there may be some issues if this program is no longer continued.
So Drew, are you saying that K3-2, I guess, yeah, K3-2 would not apply to contracts that a supplier might have that are longer than 2 years? That are with a facility other than a county facility?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm not a lawyer, again, to caveat that. We'll look into it. But yeah, so for me, this is not referring to the contracts, if Montgomery signs a contract with a supplier, this to me is not referring to all the contracts that supplier may have to come up with their total load, their ability to serve Montgomery County's load. Really, these paragraphs are referring to if there's a specific facility that Montgomery County, or the aggregator builds or acquires, or if they're contracting with, I guess, a very specific, maybe you sign a contract with, Energy's on the call, and their share of renewables, is just below a threshold you're looking for. So, you may contract with a solar facility in Montgomery County or just outside the county to hit a specific goal. I think that's where these subsections of the law are pointing to. And again, I think the legislature may have been concerned if there was a solar facility, just say built in Montgomery County specifically for this program, what would happen with that facility if this program was to be dissolved? As I said earlier, you know, a big supplier such as Energy or someone else, I would imagine, again, we didn't write this law, that they assumed they would be able to survive if this, you know, program was dissolved in short notice.
Well, it's also that suppliers don't necessarily enter into, you know, one-for-one contracts. You know, a supplier might have a contract that is intended to serve a lot of different people that they're contracted with. So it, you know, it's not that, hey, oh, I've got this 3-year contract. It's just for Montgomery County's CCA. It could be a lot of, you know, different, you know, because they're serving other customers presumably. So, you know, it's not tied directly to the county. So, you know, and presumably there's not contract, you know, the contract is, hey, if it's more than 2 years, it's the supplier's problem, or, you know, whatever the length is, it's the supplier's problem to deal with it, not the CCA's.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to need to revisit this one, as the county suggested.
So if I may, this is Lori McGilvray. Related but not totally related. One thing that I brought up on the last call that I think PSC staff said they hadn't yet contemplated that we may need to add to this draft framework is the issue of tiered rates. That is the case in a number of other CCAs around the country, where you might have one rate that is below SOS and meets the RPS, and then you may tier up from there at higher and higher levels of renewables. So that's, you know, possibly where this issue may come into play, because the offer, you know, may be making some estimates based on what happens in other parts of the country, how many of the ratepayers will opt up to higher rates of renewables. So anyway, they may or may not be related issues, but I would appreciate this issue of tiered rates at least being added to the list, so we can confirm that the regulations will foresee or permit the ability of the county to have more than one rate under the CCA.
All right, Lori, I've written it down. So
Well, can I ask, can a retail supplier currently have more than one rate? Like, do the EDI transactions allow for that?
Well, as a consumer, I certainly have looked at other suppliers who say you can have, you know, this level of renewables for this rate, and you can have this higher level of renewables for another rate. That was certainly true for my church when we went through an aggregation.
But I think that's, you know, that's my question was, can they have 2 rates at the same time?
Bev, I don't think that's where she's going. I think she's saying.
Yeah, no, I misunderstood.
Yeah, we being Montgomery County would offer kind of like a baseline rate, and then you could select a different rate with a greater, you know, lower greenhouse gas emissions.
And I apologize. I didn't understand that at first, but yeah.
This is Fran Francis. What would the default rate be? If they offer, I mean, many suppliers offer all kinds of different levels, but the customer chooses. If there's going to be more than one level, what is the default rate that you go to, and how is that communicated to the customer who's being defaulted onto the Montgomery County rate?
Right, that would be communicated exactly as you suggested. Here's the default rate, and we have other options if you're interested in these, but this is the default rate you're being put on.
So this is Misty Reininger with Potomac Edison. If we're circling back to the question that just came up, we're assuming that they're testing then with EDI processes, and we would then treat them like a normal supplier. So they would have to go through certain steps and they would have to get things programmed into the system then. Is that correct?
If they're using UCB, yeah.
Yes, if this is through the existing UCB process, and it sounds like that's the direction we're going, that yes, we will need to consider the EDI processes, because there's going to be presumably a larger volume, right? And how that's working, and if it needs to be adjusted in some form, or maybe not, for the community choice aggregator.
So Dave, this is Leah, just for real quick, a question that on this different tiers of rates and these different options. I mean, regardless of what EDI allows or doesn't allow, I mean, the utilities here do bill ready billing. So whatever happens, whatever rate a customer picks, assuming there's more than one, the supplier is going to calculate the total charge and send the total charge through, right? So it's not really relevant, I don't think, unless we're talking about Potomac Edison where you have rate ready, and there might be some differences there, but I don't know, just thinking out loud about this question.
Yeah, I mean, my initial reaction is that in terms of if Montgomery County had, let's say, 3 different options for residential customers, each customer would be who's participating would be assigned to a particular option, and then the same way 3 separate customers can have 3 separate retail supply rates, and then the EDI transaction lets the utility know here's how much their supply side of the bill is. So, my initial reaction is this works with the current system. I think Lori was asking a higher picture is, kind of does the legislation envision this? Are there any trip points within the legislation not related to EDI on this? And Lori, correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, I don't foresee how this is that much different than, presumably energy customers in PEPCO service territory. They're not all on the same contract, right? They're on lots of different contracts.
That was my point, and I know it works in other states, so I'm sure it can work in Maryland. I just wanted to be sure that we're capturing the tiered rate structure in our framework and sort of working out any details or issues to enable the county to go in that direction.
This is Bill Fields. I mean, the suppliers definitely have, they'll have customers in one service territory with lots of different rates at the same time. But I guess whether the Montgomery County offers different tiers rates or not, there's going to have to be a system for communicating changes in rates, because the Montgomery County, the aggregation rate is going to change over time, and so they're going to have to use either the regular EDI system or some other system to tell the utility about their rate changes over time, which I think, as somebody pointed out, may mean that the utility, if it's the EDI system, it maybe have to handle a lot more accounts than it used to, and we'll have to see what that means.
So, Bill, I mean, my understanding is there are lots of customers now who are on variable rates, and I assume they're changing now.
Oh yeah,
for those
but
customers.
I just mean the total number of customers.
Yeah, no. I recall Phil raising that at some point in a prior.
Oh yeah,
but yeah,
right. Companies can give the utility a different I mean, they give them different numbers to bill every month. The utility will just have to, Pepco will just have to do that for a lot more customers.
Yeah. So Judge Grace, are we, you had some requests of the utilities that you wanted to cover. I just wanted to make sure we included that as part of the discussion before we finished up today.
Yes. It seems that it would be useful to have kind of a one-on-one on the SOS procurement process, a one-on-one on PJM load assignment, and a one-on-one on consolidated billing and the pitfalls we're about to jump in with that, or what that looks like. So, and the best folks to do that, I think, would be the utilities. Is any utility willing to step up?
Hi, Judge. This is Tyler Wolverton. I think between BGE and Pepco, we can coordinate and put some slides together to fulfill that request.
Thank you so much. Is that something that you could do in 2 weeks, or?
Yeah, I don't think that's an issue. We have pretty good understanding of how that works. So 2 weeks is the next one. Okay, great.
And will that, do you know about how long that would run? Do you have an idea?
I wouldn't think more than 30 minutes. We'd probably limit it to that. People will get bored.
Well, until people start asking questions, and then.
Okay, that would be very, very helpful. And then from staff, what is the next subject that staff thinks that we need to address first or address next?
So I think the SOS, and I thank Montgomery County for getting back to us with tentative responses. I think the simplifying assumptions that we put forth, it seems like we have a reasonable amount of agreement on at least the basics, and then obviously there were some specific questions. But I think a near-term priority is this issue of the transition for SOS. So, as part of the utilities presenting at the next meeting, I don't know if this is too quick a time frame, but I do think it would be helpful to start getting some potential options, at least like straw proposals for how to make sure that we're not creating or doing what we can to mitigate the risk that SOS bidders might otherwise include in their bids going forward. So I think that's kind of a pressing issue. There was the idea of the definitions. So it sounded like Montgomery County was going to put together a list of things they think need to be defined. If we can get that relatively quickly, we could start working on that, attempt to do a little bit on that before the next meeting to maybe get some reactions from folks. But yeah, I think the SOS issue is something, and hopefully, the education will help folks understand it. But I think the degree to which the presentation can explain the challenges related to the transition, even if you don't have any straw proposals to put forward, like this is when we bid next. These are when these contracts roll off. This is how it works if load is higher than lower than we contracted for, because a bunch of customers have switched to community choice aggregation. I think it would be good to get into the basics of that as part of the SOS presentation. And, you know, I think also as part of this, you know, Potomac Edison's SOS bidding process is a bit different than BG and Pepco's in terms of timing. So, you know, it would be helpful to make sure we understand the similarities and the differences between PE and the Exelon utilities as well.
So Dave, this is Taylor Beckham from PHI. I just want to make sure that kind of we understand. It seems that you're setting up a plan for the next 2 weeks. We, the utilities, will give our presentation, and then also we'll jump right into this, how the SOS bid process is affected as kind of our first and immediate topic.
Yes, and you know, to the extent you have any straw proposals, you know, I think seeing proposals will help folks think through the issues. Would be helpful. You know, it might be a little quick to turn that around, but at least kind of laying out what happens if this goes wrong and how it could go wrong, I think would be helpful.
Okay, and by proposals, because what I'm kind of getting at, and I think that makes sense, is just trying to make sure that we kind of have some agenda topics and kind of a little bit more like topic-based discussion. I don't think what I'm not hearing is that you want the utility to put forth proposals based off of everything we talked about, but perhaps because the topic next week will be the SOS bid process, just specific topics related or specific proposals related to the SOS bid process.
Yes,
Okay.
that's what I was, not all things EDI and Instant Connect and all these things. No, I'm thinking, you know, explain the bid process, explain how you deal with, you know, if load is less than anticipated, if it's more than anticipated relative to the bid, starting, you know, explaining the schedules, you know, when the bidding happens, when the load is actually served, when those contracts will end, and then, you know, if, you know, April 2024 is when we think this could first happen, you know, what would happen if a bunch of load went away in April 2024?
Okay.
Like how that would play out, and then, you know, any straw proposals to get folks thinking, like, okay, if the utility has, you know, what if we started the transition with the goal of serving customers actual load on this date because it's when we're going to roll off those contracts. So we can start to see that, I think would be very helpful. It would allow, I think, Montgomery County to understand the potential issues there. And then, you know, I think it will just get minds churning on the different options, allow people to react to it, and things like that. So was that enough of a picture?
Yeah, I think that's good. And I know we have an issue too we want to bring up, so I don't want to, and I know that people are trying to finish up, but I think that's great for the next meeting. But I think as we move forward, if we can break these meetings up into topics. So for instance, you know, I think our presentation will try and level set everyone, but for instance, you know, with Instant Connect, if that's a really large topic, we'd have an agenda item or a topic meeting based off of that, just trying to kind of streamline our discussions a little bit, because, you know, I've heard a lot of things being thrown out there and trying to just kind of organize us a little bit. But I think as far as for 2 weeks from now, I think I have a good understanding of what we are going to give the group from the utilities. Thanks, though. I will go back on mute.
David?
I am asking that staff So I'm not a subject matter expert, and I don't know which portions of our deliverable which ones we should address first and which ones we should address next. But we have, a couple of years that we're going to be meeting with on this, and it would be really nice to know, this topic should be next, and it'll take a month, or it'll take 2 months, or hopefully we can have that portion straw man written by this date. Is that something that staff can put together?
So, yeah, I mean, we've started working a bit on that. And, I think getting some buy-in on some of the main assumptions has helped with that. But yeah, I think that's something we can work on, so long as it's agreed that it's a draft. Because I think new topics are going to come up, and folks are going to have reaction to that.
Absolutely, but it'd be great if we had kind of a schedule going forward, so we could, drop our what ifs and our scenarios into the appropriate bucket and address them at the appropriate time. But actually, starting with the basics, a presentation for everyone, and with definitions is great. But I would just ask staff to kind of give us an idea of what you think, where we should be going in a schedule going forward.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, we will meet on that, and then maybe we'll get back to you before the next meeting as well.
Thank you.
Judge Grace, this is Stan. I really appreciate the utilities agreeing to help us learn more about the SOS process and other issues. I would just ask if there's anything that they, when they present, if it's in a format that can be shared with us, so that we can, take it away and absorb it a little more after the meeting, or if it's available before the meeting, that would be great too. But just so it's not trying to absorb it just in the meeting and having to scribble lots of notes and everything. So if it can be put in a format that we can carry away, if you will, that would be super helpful. I've stunned people into silence.
No, I think we can probably do that.
Thanks.
Does anyone have anything else?
Nothing on my on my end. Thank you.
This is David Bloom with Baltimore Gas and Electric. I do have one, perhaps, administrative request, and I know it's only been 2 weeks since our last meeting, but I guess could Montgomery County give us an update either today or at the next meeting of any changes or expectations when they will have a consultant on board?
We can do that.
Great, thank you.
And this is Robbie for PHI. Just one thing I want to bring up, and I haven't heard it yet, but it's for House Bill 397 for low-income customers, where the commission has to approve the rates if a supplier is going to serve low-income customers. So I didn't know if we were going to exclude low-income from this process or how that's going to work, but just to put it out there for further discussion at a later time.
So, Robbie, is there, or maybe you could send it to Judge Grace, and then she can send it to the group. Is there anything that's been put together, kind of summarizing it, or just
yes.
somebody has the language, the law itself? That would be helpful.
We can send the link.
It's in the chat now.
Alrighty. So yeah, Judge Grace, that was all on staff's end.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I think we're done for today, and we'll see everyone back in 2 weeks. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.